Today we are starting a study of probably my favorite book of the Bible, the Epistle to the Hebrews. This is one of the most multi-layered, difficult, and yet rich books of the Bible. Anytime we launch into a study of a book of the Bible, I would suggest there are several questions that should be asked as background study. And I consider them the who, what, when, where, and why questions. So the first question we might want to consider is, who wrote the Epistle to the Hebrews? Some authorities consider Paul to have written the book, and this idea originated in Alexandria in around the 4th century. However, there are several arguments against Paul as the author. The language of the Epistle to the Hebrews is somewhat different from other Pauline epistles. The writer in chapter 2, verse 3 says that he received this information. It says the information he received was confirmed to us by those who heard, implying a second or third hand reception of the information. Whereas we know Paul received the things that he wrote about directly from Jesus. When was the book written? Some historical references seem to place the writing around 80 AD or possibly later, but certainly it was written before 96 AD, which was the writing of the book of Revelation, as we know is the last book of the Bible. However, probably the book was written before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD due to there being references of temple sacrifice, and quite possibly was written during or after Nero's persecution in 64 AD due to references in the epistle about people having their homes invaded and possessions seized because of their faith in Jesus. Well, why was it written, and to whom was it written? There's no formal title for the recipients of the letter, although the audience is presumed by the content. Surely, as we'll see, that the recipients were Jewish or Hebrew Christians. And it was written not to persuade the audience not to return to Judaism, but to argue against believers falling away from the faith. As we see in the first three passages, or first three verses, and let's go ahead and read those. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. And he is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. When he had made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So as we can see in these first three verses, there are just some distinctions made between the Old and the New Testaments. Verse 1, we see that it says that God spoke to the fathers in the prophets. And we know that the prophets were sinful men. They were imperfect men. And he contrasts this with God speaking to us through Jesus, who, as we know, was perfect and sinless. It says that he spoke in many ways and in many portions, and yet we know that through Jesus he is speaking in one way. It says that he spoke long ago to the fathers, and we know that he's saying that now in these latter days, the present time, he is speaking to us through Jesus. And it says that long ago in the Old Testament he spoke to the fathers, and now he says that he speaks to us in verse 2. So in summary for these first three verses, we know that Jesus is God's final word to us. There's no need for any other word to be spoken. It says in verse 3 that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of God's nature. So one might say that Jesus is God with skin on. And finally, because it says that Jesus upholds all things by the word of his power, we might consider Jesus to be the glue of the universe. Without Jesus, the world, the universe, who we are would fall apart. Some questions that you may want to consider for discussion In what way or ways is Jesus God's final word to us? Number 2, what does all things refer to in verse 2? How is Jesus heir of all things, and how does that involve us as believers? For help, you may want to refer to Romans 8, verses 16 and 17. And finally, just how does Jesus represent God to us? So I would encourage you to consider these questions and discuss them among yourselves. And for our next session, we'll move further into chapter 1.